Welcome. Waves of Amarants complete the human mosaic. By means of existing haplogroup maps, we show in a clear and simplified way that the Amazon Amarants, and later the other Amarants, completed the mosaic or puzzle of all modern humans in steps with patches, this by literally churning out of their cradles a series of waves towards all parts of the world. Each new wave adds a new and intact patch to the human mosaic, but it also leaves the rest of the human mosaic more divided and complex to read. When the patches are presented step by step, this visually creates an evolving mosaic, kind of a morphing embryo. We will do exactly that in this video until the patches and morphing embryo fill up the whole world and the human mosaic. Then certain patches will start to migrate from the point they were delivered and will also start to mix. From that moment on, we will read the by now complex end result mosaic by means of the haplogroups that we learned and that science and consensus produced for many years or decades. American cradles. The American cradles are composed by the Amazon forest cradle and later by subcradles in South, Central, and North America. Since the Younger Dryas event that started in North America, the North America cradle became the most important one. The first cradle or the root of the origin, was the Amazon forest, with the origin of all humans, the Amazon Amarants, fundamentally proven in other videos and ebooks. Multiple new roots, also called cradles or subroots, were developed outside the Amazon, but all still in the Americas. Since the Younger Dryas, only one very extensive North America root location dominated all the waves and descending new patches. Since the Younger Dryas, the descending new patches from that new cradle were dominantly or all boomers. The boomers present YDNAR and completely turned over Western Eurasia. Just before the boomers, the same North American root had churned out more recent YDNA, amongst others YDNAI. The Britain turnover figure of David Reich shows us in high resolution how I was turned over by one of the boomers. The Iberia turnover figure of David Reich shows us in high resolution how a boomer parent, blue dots, was turned over by a boomer's child, red dots, this roughly starting 4,250 years ago. When certain North Atlantic roots are intensively used, in between patches can be found along the route. These patches are living proof of the cradles, roots and destinations, and the formation of the human mosaic. Such patches, possibly necklaces, can exist in all roots, especially the ones that involve islands that probably presented logistics. I claim that in the more recent and more massive waves, logistics underway were present and important, also for strategic reasons. Cradle, since the Neanderthal, cradle of the hybrids. This particular North American cradle had been the source already long before. For example, most probably it descended the older hybrids like the Neanderthal, including through the North Atlantic routes. You can still detect Neanderthal frequencies on the islands that they used or passed by, on the ice or navigating boats. Like on islands such as the Svalbard archipelago, that includes Spitsbergen, all the way east to Severnaya Zemlya. The used islands include Nova Zembla, that was later often used to enter via the main Arctic route in order to go south to Altai Mountains or as much south as Pakistan and India, etc. From Nova Zembla, there is another route down that follows the Ural Mountains to the Caspian and Black Sea. Pre-Neanderthal and early Neanderthal probably came from the earlier South American cradles, located closer to the origin, the Amazon Amarant in the Amazon forest. Similar to the Neanderthal, the Denisovan also used or passed certain Arctic islands more to the east when migrating, just as the Neanderthals did, from the American cradles. Earlier Denisovan, just as the earlier Neanderthals, made less use of the Arctic routes as their cradles, most probably dominantly in South America, to migrate to eastern Eurasia, Australia, and possibly Pakistan, India, etc. And in the case of the Neanderthaler, possibly to the southern Atlantic facade of Europe and the north coast of the Mediterranean. Archaic haplotypes. Also presented is the figure of haplotypes, of which B006 of the Neanderthal and Denisovan is one of them. This figure of the haplotypes by itself is an indication of early hybridization and of the continentality of such hybridizations, with the Americas being the oldest and the main continents to present these old haplotype hybrids. As said above, in the case of the Neanderthal descending to Europe and the rest of the world from the Americas, most probably Arctic roots and not the North Atlantic route were involved or dominantly used. The fact that Neanderthals and Denisovans were less present in Africa probably indicates the use of cradles high up in North America, as well as the use of Arctic routes. Arctic routes did not involve boats or navigation over sea, and allowed or almost obliged bringing animals or even herds along. Arctic routes and entries were very well chosen, and consequently, there was a limited number of them. Arctic routes presented opportunities to hunt and fish and to obtain fresh water. At least later, most probably the Arctic routes presented logistics and services. Arctic routes very probably were used by migrating animals, including megafauna. There is evidence of trade while on Arctic routes or irregular traveling up and down the Arctic routes. South American cradles and Pacific routes. Before the Younger Dryas, the route or routes in South America had played a more important role, and had churned out to Oceania, Indonesia and eastern Eurasia mainly through Pacific routes, forming or completing some of the most ancient cultures. There is clear genetic and strong evidence for this. As said, at least since the Younger Dryas, the massive boomers or all Western Eurasians came from the new North American massive route, that churned out all or dominantly through the mentioned short and quick North Atlantic route and gyre. This possibly justified the moving away from the origin of all waves, especially if it were hybridizations, as I claim and argue in other videos. Former turnover events, parting from the North American route, had made use of other routes, like for instance routes to the Arctic Siberian entries and rivers that lead south to Central Eurasia, like the Altai Mountains, and further south to South Eurasia, like the Indus Valley culture. For this they extended the North Atlantic routes or used again the older Arctic routes. Once they arrived in Eurasia, they started their turnovers, which became more massive because their new North America route had become more massive. This new North America route now spanned from east to west North America, with all in between them very well connected by rivers and waterways. In their turnovers in Western Eurasia, the boomers etc. eliminated the former Y DNA but absorbed much of the mitochondrial DNA. Because of the systematic arrival in Eurasia of a series of American Y DNA, the boomers etc. also ended up overturning the present Eurasian X DNA or autosome, possibly initially without affecting much of the Eurasian mitochondrial DNA. When one wants to overturn the DNA of an existing group with a new hybrid DNA, this is easier to accomplish through hybrid males for more than one reason. This is part of the reasons why only after the boomer males dominated at least parts of Western Eurasia, also women with newly hybridized North American mitochondrial X, the boomer women, would come over to Eurasia and join the boomer males that already had overturned certain parts of Western Eurasia. Any other way would reduce the mass production of hybrids and the turnover itself. There is strong evidence this strategy was chosen and executed very deliberately. Other pieces of the puzzle before the boomers. Amarand Y-DNA, Q being the ancestor of all humans, expands from the origin in the Amazon forest to most if not all of the world just by itself, including to all of Eurasia and even to Africa. Presenting a map of Q in Europe that is not visible on the world map. This Q in Europe is largely wiped out by the boomers and waves similar to that of the boomers, descending from the same North American cradle, but this before the boomers. Like Y-DNA, that also used Iceland on its way to Western Eurasia. Resuming, all former expansions out of the Americas became partially wiped out by later new-coming groups that were churned out by the same American cradle or cradles and used the same routes and in-betweens. Q gives rise to C. C expands west all the way to Europe, just as Q itself did before. Probably C once advanced even further into Europe, but probably was wiped out partially by later newcomers, just like was the case with the earlier Q itself. Anyhow, C is an indirect renewal and an extension of the Amarant Q. The root of the Y-DNA haplogroup C is in the Americas, so that relates C to the Americas and not to Africa. The Amarant and its first descendant C together now form a new basis for C and as well as for its antecessor Q, to expand again all the way from the extreme east of Eurasia, touching the extreme west of Eurasia, which is Western Europe, at the height of the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. Q itself had reached farther east before touching Western Europe and Africa, but even then C was a renewal that pumped up the frequencies. Observation: Y-DNA-C had been coming from South and North American cradles and had been migrating directly to Oceania, Australia, Indonesia, and probably behind, even before it migrated into Eurasia. From Australia and Indonesia, C could have reached the western Pacific coasts or Far East Asia by the Kuroshio Current, as well as the North Indian Ocean or the ancient cultures, as well as the African coasts, including Madagascar, by the equatorial currents. Since this southern sea route is older and there were a lot of new waves after them, dominance of C cannot be detected after Australia and the Bay of Bengal. Above of C, N can be found. N could be an expansion of C, or N could come directly out of North America through Arctic routes and rivers. Below of C, D can be found. D could be an expansion of C that pushed south, but as we will see, most probably D comes out of the Americas through one of the Pacific routes and next through the Indian Ocean and rivers. Much the same way as Q did itself once before. D will be overtaken by O, this through the same routes as that D and possibly Q once installed themselves. One can see that O and later E made pressure on Madagascar and most probably made pressure on Africa too, with E able to break through Africa on both coasts, probably as far as North and Western Africa. At least in the alphabetical order proposed by consensus, E comes after D. Consensus considers D the antecessor of E or even a kind of extra connected partner groups. That is justifiable by a permanent current that flows from Southeast Asia and Indonesia to Madagascar and Africa. Until now, the direct Y-DNA descendants of Q, such as C, Asia and Australia, and D, China, etc., and next to come E, Africa, and H, Africa, have letters that come very early in the alphabet, which means in the order that consensus gave them. C, D, and E fit much more to Q, the Amarants, and the Americas, than they fit to Africa. The root of C lies in the Americas, and the region that D occupies has many genetic connections to the Amarants. The same as for C and D is also the case for C and H, but this time the location is next east, making use of a waterway system, and route east of the former ones, making more use of the Indian Ocean. H will be overtaken by L, this through the same routes as that H etc. once installed itself. Here I refer to Y-DNA L and not to mitochondrial L. Y-DNA L already hits on Egypt and the Nile in Africa, but even more on the facades of Western Europe. E follows up D. E follows up D and will bring Q and the Amarants to all the Africa coasts and much less to the center of Africa. Next and east to D comes Y-DNA E. E dominates Africa above the Sahara, but also much of the Sahara and of sub-Saharan Africa as well. In other videos I will claim and argue that E comes from the east, from Q, D and O, H and L, C, most logic from Australia, and also from the Y-DNA R hybrid R1BV88 that comes from South America and is a possible sister or child from the Boomers, which was able to cut its way from the west-central African coast to as far east as the Nile. The vulnerability of Africa for introgression goes on until the colonial period and the period of enslaving and exporting. While the out-of-Africa hypothesis indirectly indicates weakness of the Africans, by claiming they got stronger by interbreeding with the Neanderthal, I generally do not agree with this, and I claim that Africans are an old stable group that is from strong to very strong, however the continent as a whole is historically vulnerable to introgressions from the outside, and this from very early on. Y-DNA A and B, and also mitochondrial DNA L. There is evidence of pressure from all of these groups on Madagascar or Africa itself. There is also evidence for similar pressure even from mitochondrial groups like B. Such pressure and leaking in from all sides is atypical for a continent that would deliver the ancestor of all humans to the world. Y-DNA E, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, has very much focus on the facades. That would be typical for a group that invades a continent later, and this from the ocean and sea facades inwards. All the pressure to the inside of Africa gives the impression of multi-regionality, which is also atypical for a continent that is supposed to populate the whole world. We already saw that D or H come from Q and the Americas. Q on its turn comes from the Amazon forest, that spreads Q in a star-like form to the rest of South America and later to Central and North America. In other videos, over 10 fundamentals prove that the Amazon Amerind is the origin of all humans. Thank you for watching.